So to start us off is Alex Forrest from Winnipeg, Canada. He's known as union leader, firefighter, and a lawyer. So please welcome Alex Forrest.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. This is an absolute honor to be here. I'm joined today with my executive from Winnipeg too. They have come to help sort of spread the word of what presumptive legislation is, prevention, and we're hoping that Iceland very soon will be the first country in Europe to adopt legislation that will allow firefighters to be properly compensated when they get diagnosed with cancer, with occupational cancer. You have an absolutely beautiful country. I managed to get into Iceland a few days ago, and we drove down to Vik and Hoffen, and we were just stunned by the beauty. You're very fortunate to live in one of the most beautiful countries in the world, and it's an absolute honor for me to be here. My name's Alex Forrest. I'm a fire captain. I'm a firefighter. I've been a firefighter for 29 years. I'm a captain in the fire department. I've been a union leader for 22 years. I've been a lawyer for 23 years as well. So everything sort of pushed me to do this. Everything's pushed me to be a health and safety advocate that I've been doing now for over 20 years. And we've had quite a bit of success in Canada, the United States, and also Australia, and we're moving into Europe. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give a sort of an overview of what's going to happen in the next few days and just touch on some of the issues, because we have other experts here that are going to be able to flesh out some of the issues that I'm going to be talking about today. The Cancer Summit overview today will be science, presumptive legislation, and prevention. They all go hand in hand. And Mr. Carlson, Mr. Bjorn Carlson, I really appreciate you sharing your personal story with us. We know how hard that is, and we know that because firefighters do the same across the world, because that's how we get this issue out to the public and to the politicians, is we have firefighters who have occupational cancer that put themselves out to be able to educate that there's a real issue when it comes to occupational cancer. You had mentioned that many of the studies say 15 to 20%. While there is some studies that go as high as 50% increase, and many scientists believe that they're actually underestimated the level of cancer because of healthy worker effect and other confounding issues that have done that. And I can tell you from doing this for over 20 years, when I talk to medical physicians who actually deal with firefighter cancer, what they tell me is that firefighter cancers are usually more aggressive. They attack firefighters much earlier in age, and they metastasize much quicker to other areas of the body. So the tragedy of cancer is something that all of the populations of the world have to deal with, and firefighters now have to deal with it on a level that's almost unequaled in the world. And one of the tragic ironies that I always say is that we all love our jobs. We have a brother and sisterhood that's unequaled around the world, and that's why we have such a gathering here today from all over Europe, United States, Canada, Australia, because there really truly is no borders. And a profession that we love so much is so hard on us. I can tell you the IFF, we represent 310,000 firefighters in Canada and the United States, and we track the cancer deaths. And this year, we are going to have close to 200 firefighters who have died of occupational cancer in North America in the last year. It's going to be close to 75% of all line of duty deaths are going to come from occupational cancer. So this issue is really vital to us, because what we're also seeing is we are attacking it on a level of prevention that's unequaled, and Europe is some of the leading countries in doing this. But the problem we have is that the prevention is only one piece of the puzzle. we have a duty to do everything we can to minimize the cancer risk. Unfortunately, we cannot minimize it to zero. That's why we have legislation in Canada, United States, and Australia that makes it an automatic presumption that if a firefighter gets certain cancers, they would be presumed to have got that cancer from their job. And what occurs then in Canada, for instance, they are looked after no different than if that firefighter had died in a building trying to rescue a child. So we make no difference between a traumatic on-scene death and an occupational cancer. It's not one fire that kills us, it's hundreds of fires throughout our careers. It's a cumulative effect that has the effect upon us, and that's why you see cancer rates even higher as firefighters progress through their careers. Science is the big thing. Science is the big mover, and I'll talk about the history of science here in a second. And we have Jeffrey's going to speak on the science, and he is one of the best experts we have in North America, and he'll be able to give you a good overview of the specific studies. But I just want to say a few things about science. Science is almost like a puzzle. You have a puzzle, and every study is one piece of that puzzle. No one study is conclusive, whether it's connected to firefighting and cancer, but put them all together, you start seeing a picture. And what we're seeing now, because the studies are getting more sophisticated, the studies are getting bigger, and they're starting to show a picture. And that picture is of tragedy of firefighters that are dying at very high rates in almost every country of the world. These studies are not just centered in North America or Australia or Europe. They're all around the world. We even have a Korean study that replicated many of the results of the North American and Australian studies that showed the connection between firefighting and occupational cancer. The studies are just that. And I'm going to talk about that in a second, is that studies are only as good as the work that's put into them. You can have bad studies and you can have good studies. And science is a very exact art, because you have to have a 95% certainty to be able to have a statistically significant element. So if anything goes wrong within that study, you will not reach that threshold. You may have an elevation of cancers, but it may not reach the scientific threshold of 95%, which is statistically significant. So you always got to read studies, and you got to understand what the elevation was, the different events that led it to that. And studies, we now know, have to be done properly for firefighters, because we are a very small population. Even studies that we see out of NIOSH that did 30,000 firefighters, the tens of thousands of firefighters that we studied in Australia, there were still lapses because we did not have enough firefighters. One example of that is our sister firefighters. We studied 30,000 firefighters in NIOSH, and we did not have sufficient numbers of females to be able to have a statistically significant study done on female cancers. And we know that the predominant firefighters are male. So it's something like, we know that there's environmental factors on many of the female cancers, such as breast cancer and such, that affects female firefighters, but it's almost impossible to prove unless you had a massive study of female firefighters. So the numbers are as important as the study itself many times. And IARC. All roads lead to IARC. IARC is the International Agency of Research on Cancer. This is the leading organization of the World Health Organization. And this organization dictates to governments all around the world legislation and policies on cancer research, etc. And we are dealing with IARC now as we speak. I have the great fortune of being an observer on IARC. I've been to many meetings, and I'll talk about IARC in a second, because I think IARC is the key to issue up around the world when it comes to firefighting and occupational cancer. Science is not exact method, but one thing we will say is every single study we see, we're seeing that there is some connection to firefighting and occupational cancer. okay? Just because a specific cancer may not be mentioned in that study, it doesn't mean that there isn't a connection, it just means that it was inconclusive. And there's so many factors, as I've said, that could involve with studies. But almost every study we see has some type of connection with some cancer and firefighting. So we know that there's a cancer there. We know that there's a connection. And that's what we've accepted in legislation in Canada, United States, and Australia. The science, and we're going to go into this, but these are some of the major studies. We have the master study, which is one of the biggest meta-analysis of over 100,000 firefighters. That was a very big study, and it was one of the first big studies that have led to other studies that have come forward. NIOSH, this was a study of 30,000 firefighters looking at Chicago, San Francisco, and Philadelphia. We have the Nordic study, so we show that there's a conclusive connection between firefighting and occupational cancer in Nordic countries. And the Monash study out of Australia. And the reason I want to talk about this, and Peter Marshall's going to fill this in more, but the study out of Australia was basically the largest study ever done for firefighters because it looked at volunteer firefighters, it looked at part-time firefighters, wildland, forestry firefighters, and urban professional firefighters. And one thing that we saw in the Monash study is we saw that science can be manipulated just like any other element. It was a study that was funded by a group that tried to stop the presumptive legislation in Australia. And it was only because of the hard work of Peter Marshall, who's head of the firefighter union in Australia, that managed to get me on the scientific advisory committee overseeing this study. And as soon as I sat in on that study, I knew the fix was in. But what we managed to do is we took elements of the study out, and what happened is at the end of the study, it became a very important study because it showed a conclusive link to occupational cancer for many of the cancers. And that wasn't the intent of that study. So that's a message I want to give to everybody, is that if you're doing a study, be very conscientious that we have our enemies out there. And people say, well, science can't be manipulated. Scientists, all you have to do is look at the tobacco industry. For 20 years, they knew that there was a connection between tobacco use and lung cancer. And the tobacco company used the very essence of science to create inconclusive studies, even though they knew. And it was only because of legal cases that came out after where these doctors that were bought by these tobacco companies started to have moral problems. And they came forward and said, yes, we had manipulated the data to allow tobacco companies this. And this resulted in millions of dollars of lawsuits against tobacco companies. And it's no different with us. We have presumptive legislation, proper prevention costs money. And there's organizations, that's their bottom line. And you have to be very conscientious of that. And it may be a very hardened view, but it's a reality. So there is occupation. When I became a observer at IARC, almost within a week, I was told that there was 3 other organizations, plastic companies, that also wanted to be observers and had put doctors on that committee to basically watch what I was doing. Right? So I just wanted you guys to know, and Peter will talk a little bit more about this soon. IARC, like I said, this is the key. IARC basically, in 2010, looked at firefighting for the first time. And many of the scientists and epidemiologists and people in IARC are on IARC now, and I've talked to many of them, and they even admit that they did not fully understand that there's different types of firefighting. They didn't understand that there's other factors involved, such as the stress of the job that can impact upon cancer. Shift. Matter of fact, in the same report of firefighting, where they made firefighting a 2B classification. IARC has 3 classifications for the connection between a carcinogen or profession and cancer. Class 1 is a conclusive connection 2A is a probable connection and 2B is possible connection. We were classified at 2B because it was such a new issue they were starting. But it was interesting because shift work was classified as 2A. So as I told them, I said, how can you have shift work at 2A and firefighters at a lower level of risk when we do shift work? And they said, well, we were told that firefighters, they sleep all night and they don't have that type of shift work. We thought shift work only applied to nurses that stay up all the time. And so that was when they looked at it in 2010, there was no input, no scientific expertise from firefighters. I believe IARC will look at this again. And next time, there will be expertise on there. We will have doctors, epidemiologists that will be able to talk about the nature of firefighting. Because one of the things we do in North America and Australia is we just don't talk about cancer. Many times we do what's called fire ops, where we bring these doctors, we bring these politicians, and we actually put them in firefighting gear, and we put them through a fighting scenario where they're in burn buildings, and they have to case fire. And they understand our job. And that's going to help them understand the connection between firefighting and occupational cancer. Benzene. I just finished the latest meeting of IARC. And if you know about benzene, it's probably one of the most dangerous carcinogens that IARC has classified. It was one of the first chemicals they classified as extremely toxic. And they looked at benzene not once, but twice, and they just looked at it again for the third time. And they looked at benzene. And the interesting thing is we have studies in North America and Australia where every single fire we go to has a benzene exposure. There's like safe levels of benzene are around 0.5 parts per million, and we are getting studies that show that 20 to 30 parts per million are at the average fire, a car fire, etc. And that's because of the benzene exposure. So what they did is they looked at benzene again, and they had all these scientists and analysis, and IARC has done such a good job with benzene that there's very little connection between benzene and workers because they have safety elements in place. So they were looking at professions that still had a connection to benzene without protection. And it was really interesting because the scientists saw and the epidemiologists saw that there was only 2 places they could find studies where people were coming into contact at dangerous levels of benzene. Textile workers in China and firefighters. Those were the only 2 studies where they could check, like in the oil industry, people are protected when they deal with benzene products. Firefighters do not. And the Chinese textile workers, they had many studies in regards to inappropriate labor policies with workers in China dealing with benzene products. That wakes up IARC, and that's why I truly believe that benzene is going to one day push IARC to look at firefighting again. Because I think it opened their eyes. That one of the things that I really want to say today is that no matter how good our prevention is, no matter how good our clothing is, we're still going to come in contact with dangerous chemicals at every single fire. We can minimize that, and we have an absolute duty to minimize that, but we're still going to come in contact. And many of the prevention techniques that we're doing now is going to help us 30 years from now. Because you have to understand there's a latency period. The people that are getting cancer in the fire service now are people that joined the fire service 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. And we know that there's been an increased use of plastics. We all know as firefighters here that there's very little wood products that go into building designs. We know that plastics, every single year China comes on the market with over a dozen new plastics to make things cheaper. And many of those plastics, they have no idea what the chemical impact is when it starts on fire. So we know that before it gets better, even if we were to impact the best prevention now, the best equipment now, it would take 20 to 30 years to work through the system to start lowering our cancer rates. So that's important to understand when we talk about presumptive legislation, that it's like two roads. We have to do prevention. We have to do everything we can. You know, there should be a zero tolerance in the fire service for smoking. There should be education on diet. There should be education on lifestyle, sleep habits, etc. That has to be, you have to minimize your cancer risk as much as you can, because one of your biggest cancer risks is your profession of firefighting. As I'm going to talk about presumptive legislation here for a second, and tell you what presumptive legislation is firefighting presumptive legislation in North America was not the first presumptive legislation. The first presumptive legislation, and we have our friends here from the UK, was chimney sweeps. 1780. Chimney sweeps, young children under the age of 8, many were 5, 6 years old, were dying extreme cancers of scrotum and testicular cancer. And what it was in industrial age England, these chimney sweeps, the smaller they were, the better chimney sweeps they were. And they were not provided clothing, they were sent down these chimneys, and they were to clean the chimneys. And I'm reading the data that Percival Potts was brought in by the government of the time to say, this is embarrassing for us. We can't have all these kids dying of cancer. These horrible deaths. And even though they had very primitive scientific techniques, they knew something was up with these children. So Percival Potts grabbed these children, many children that were dying of cancer. He would bring them into the hospital beds, clean them up, and put them into beds. And then the next day he'd come back and the sheets were black as could be. And he says, well, how could this be? We just cleaned them. Then they realized it was coming out of their pores. We know now that what was coming out of their pores was basically polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon. Right? So we know that soot contains carcinogens. And so Percival Potts basically put this forward and said, you know, this is crazy. We have to create some type of law to prevent people from taking advantage of these children. So in England, in industrial age, they created the first presumptive legislation, I believe in 1781, and they said that you could not be a chimney sweep until you were 8 years old. You had to have one set of clothing, and you had to go to church on Saturday morning. But the interesting thing is Percival Potts spoke at the Parliament because there was no punitive element to it. They took the punitive element out of it, so it didn't really change a lot. But one of the things that it did do is there was chimney sweeps in Germany. What they did in Germany is they did push issues with clothing and cleanliness, and it did reduce the level of cancer in chimney sweeps in Germany. And that study just came out just a few years after that particular study. So science does drive legislation. And what I always say is we are today's chimney sweeps. We're going into those chimneys and we're dying of cancer, and we need legislation to help us. And Percival Potts is really what IARC is. IARC was put in place by the World Health Organization to oversee most of the countries of the world. Every country here today is part of IARC. And IARC pushes governments to enact policies, procedures, and law. And that's where we have with presumptive legislation. Presumptive legislation levels the playing field. It says if you are a firefighter, and I'm talking about the Canadian presumptive legislation, if you are a firefighter and you get diagnosed with occupational cancer, one of the list of cancers that are connected to science, you would be automatically covered for loss of wages, etc. And it's very interesting because the most important part of this legislation, and you talk about family, sir, and how important it is. And When I get calls, and I get calls from all over the world, I have cancer. Will our legislation cover me? And when I talk to the firefighters and they tell me, I have very advanced cancer. I have a bladder cancer, kidney cancer. And the doctor says that it's it for me and I only have 2 to 3 years to live, etc. They aren't concerned about themselves. They're concerned about their family and how their financial aspect will occur when they're gone. They aren't caring. That's what firefighters are. Firefighters are very private individuals. And one of the things that you'll find, until you get a legislation that actually tracks the cancers, you will find that there's many firefighters that have cancer that no one knows about. We're a very private group of people. And it's very sad because many firefighters get diagnosed with cancer and they retire and you never know that they died because of their job. So what we do in Canada is we have legislation and the legislation in North America started. It started in basically the United States, and it started because there's no universal health care in the United States. And the presumptive legislation was to get the firefighters basically health care. That's how it really started. And then it went to pensions, and then it went to loss of wages. And the American system is very all over the place. It isn't consistent from one state to the other. But in Canada, what we managed to do is we started in 2002. Not one firefighter had ever been covered for occupational cancer in Canada prior to 2002, and the province of Manitoba became the first province in Canada to enact legislation. We then created a very strong piece of legislation that we knew was going to be defensible and we knew was going to be able to be accepted across Canada. We then went to almost every single province. Then we went to Alberta, which was arguably one of the hardest provinces we were going to get covered because it was an anti-labor, conservative province. And that's where we built the relationship up with Edmonton. We said if we can get presumptive legislation in Alberta, we can get it anywhere in Canada. So we took that on. And when we first brought it forward, they laughed at us. And they said, you firefighters, oh, you're so cute. You don't understand how politics work. You got to go this and that, but we'll help you. And a few years from now, we might be able to do something. Well, you tell firefighters they can't do something. Well, I can tell you the Alberta firefighters, they put on a political display that was unequaled, and they managed to go to the leadership of Alberta. And something like a couple months after that minister told us there was no chance, they passed the legislation word for word what Manitoba's was, and they even added a cancer. So what we did then is we said, hey, we got 2 provinces. Today, instead of me going through the whole story, we are now through every single province in Canada. 98% of firefighters in Canada, volunteers, part-time and professional, all are covered if they get occupational cancer under presumptive legislation. So we now have that 100%. The United States, the IFF is composed of 310,000 firefighters in Canada and the United States. We have literally put in millions of dollars into lobbying, political action, and above all, science in trying to move this forward. And what we're now doing is we have 40 of our 50 states that have it, and we have a goal that we want every single state in the United States to not only have presumptive, but we're also looking at states that currently have it, and if they have a weak piece of legislation, we're going to improve upon it because we know how to do it now. We know we can't trust legislators to write the legislation. We need to be part of that. We know we can't, we need to be part of the scientific community. We now know how to improve the legislation. Australia's campaign for presumptive legislation. Australia was just like Europe was today. There was no presumptive legislation in Australia in 2010. And then what happened is Peter Marshall came to the Global Alliance where we had all the firefighters from around the world meet. I believe it was in Vancouver. And Australia said, we like what you have in Canada and the United States. Can you come over and talk to us? Well, it was absolutely amazing. We talked to we made presentations to the firefighters across the country. and we made presentations to the legislation and to the federal government. And within a year and a half, Australia had federal legislation. And I'm not going to talk about this because Peter is the genius behind this, the political person. We had the science, but it was his political strategy that managed to move this to almost every jurisdiction, either has it now or is considering the legislation today. And that was only a few years ago. So don't think that things can't change fast. Europe. And I think it started about 11 years ago. Finland. The sauna in Finland. Oh, well, I'll never forget that. With my executive member Tom, Kim Nikula, Michael Sandberg, Anders Setterberg, they started it in Europe. They started it at that conference, and you guys are moving it forward in Europe on different levels, and I'm going to let Tommy talk more about that and what's going on there. But you are seeing, you may not have the same type of legislation, but I can tell you that Europe has actually surpassed us when it comes to prevention. Europe is standing behind what their belief is, especially in Sweden and Denmark. Some of the preventive techniques we are learning from you guys in the United States and Canada about decon, after fire hygiene, etc. Europe, I always say, it's a battle. It's an unbelievable battle. It's a sacrifice. And I'm going to talk about some of the people that have literally put their lives on hold to work on this issue for firefighters in Europe. But you are close. I don't know whether it's going to be Sweden or Norway or Denmark or Germany, but one of these countries are going to do it. Maybe Iceland. We had a tremendous meeting yesterday with Chief Parkinson, and I can tell you that your union leadership and your chief are on board about what needs to be done here in this country. And I think you guys are very fortunate to have that. Because if the union and management can work together for the health and safety of their firefighters, they can accomplish anything that's needed. And I think that's very important. Prevention, I have a presentation on prevention at the end of the presentation, so I won't, but I just wanted to show a video. And this video basically talks about why we do this battle. Boston is the biggest, Boston and New York are two of our biggest departments in North America. And they're also some of the roughest, toughest firefighters you'll ever see. And it's a cultural change when you talk about cancer, because you need to have clean gear. You need to have good hygiene. You can't be the dirty firefighter anymore. And Boston learned this the hard way. So I'm just going to let the video talk. And it's a very important video to show firefighters when it talks about life and death. And many of the individuals you're going to see here talking have died of the cancers.
Today we added new faces to this wall behind me. These guys are dying way too young. There's too many of them. They shouldn't be dying at 52, 53 years old, and they are. That bothers me that these guys aren't here anymore, that they weren't able. Today we added new faces to this wall behind me. These guys are dying way too young. There's too many of them. They shouldn't be dying at 52, 53 years old, and they are. That bothers me that these guys aren't here anymore, that they weren't able to hang around a little bit longer for their families. Our job is dangerous, but the hidden danger of our job is getting us.
We call this wall the cancer wall. It's a reminder of my brothers and sisters who have gone through what I'm going through.
Firefighters have very high risk for occupational cancers from their exposures on the job. The past several years, we've seen a lot of firefighters in the late 30s, early 40s come down with certain cancers that typically we see in people in the 50s and late 60s.
A lot of guys got it. A lot of guys walking around don't know they got it and probably do have it.
And I realized I had two little bumps right behind my clavicle. I remember pushing on it, squeezing, and no pain. Now, my wife happens to be a registered nurse. She felt the bumps, Her eyes opened up wide. She looked at me and said, "You need to call tomorrow." I was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma.
Testicular cancer is a little different. They do not biopsy, they just pull your testicle right out, and then they biopsy.
I was 35 when I got diagnosed. All I could think about was dying young.
The cancer's taken a little bit more out of me. Every 3 weeks I go in for scans. Every 3 weeks I go in for chemo.
We don't want to see this. I don't ever want to see it. Unfortunately, we will.
There's a lot of firefighters' pictures that are on walls all across union halls in America and all across fire departments in America that lost their life due to cancer-related illness. I personally know myself, since I've been the mayor, 3 or 4 folks that have died.
We've had over 190 Boston firefighters succumb to occupational cancer since 1990.
My own brother, who has 31 years in the job, just came down with cancer.
No pain, no signal, nothing. The oncologist and my urologist told me that bladder cancer is a common cancer for firefighters.
You don't think it's gonna happen when you're this young, and hopefully it doesn't.
I was more fearful for my wife than I was for myself. Already I was feeling my mortality.
They're telling me that it's terminal, that it's incurable. I'm learning to accept it. I have cancer, but it doesn't have me. I just hope I stick around a little bit longer for my kids.
I'll never forget my first fire right out of the academy. One of the guys said, "Oh, don't put your mask on yet. Save it till you get to the fire." I said, "Okay." For a week, every time you take a shower, your pores open up and you can smell the smoke. You blow your nose for a couple of days later and that's all you have is black coming out of you. I never thought of it back then, but I think of it now. Man, what was that stuff doing to my insides?
When there's smoke, there's cancer. I really want firefighters to remember that. Exposure to particulates within smoke can cause cellular changes. These cancer-causing chemicals travel into the bloodstream, set up in different organ systems, cause DNA damage, mutations, abnormal cell growth, and cancer develops.
As soon as you can see 2 feet in front of you, you take your mask off and go to work. Well, that's probably one of the most dangerous times because it's floating around and you let your guard down. The smoke is loaded with carcinogens. It's not conducive to life, smoke.
There was a fire in a power plant in 2002 in South Boston where we had 9 alarms and over 200 Boston firefighters responded. Over 50 of those members have developed a significant cancer, cardiac issue, or lung disease, and 15 have succumbed to their exposure. Mark Matthews, Billy Foley, Kevin McNiff were all at that fire, as well as Glenn Preston. Glenn, 40 years old, 4 young children under 8. It was his first significant fire.
The chemicals that were involved in that fire, the carcinogenics that were being given off, it was like you were working on an oil dike. Whatever was burning, mineral oil or whatever, it just wouldn't go out with water. I've never seen smoke like it. In your mouth, in your eyes, in your ears, in your nose. Unfortunately, the mask we had back then wouldn't stay secure to our face because of the oil coming down our face. So we took a beating.
We're working with Dana-Farber to identify the risks to the members that responded to that fire and try to get them into early screening and testing to hopefully catch something in its incipient stage.
I really do believe that that fire is why John's up in that wall, why I'm sitting here, and why Matthews is up in that wall, why Frankie Flynn's no longer here. That fire is, in my opinion, where we all got cancer. But I went right back to the firehouse with that gear I had and put it on the next fire I went to, and used that gear for quite a while before we finally put it out of service.
The dirtier your equipment was, the more work it appeared that you did, and the more macho you were. You come back, you smell like smoke, you don't jump in the shower right away, you don't wash your clothes, and your bunker gear just sat with the smoke and the soot on it.
Everyone thinks they're invincible. After almost 32 years, I find out I'm not so invincible. Someone asked me one time, "You have any regrets about becoming a firefighter?" I said, no regrets at all. I'd do it again. But what I would do, and I tell them this, is I'd keep my mask on more than I did.
Before Mark passed, he told me, "Rich, tell the guys, wear their face piece, clean their bunker gear. If he could do it all over again, he would."
Firefighting is an inherently dangerous job, and we are going to be exposed, and we are going to be in risky environments. We can reduce the chronic exposure to smoke and soot. It's taking that personal responsibility upon yourself to make sure you don't take smoke needlessly, that you're protected at all times in that hostile environment.
Boston Fire Department is fighting back against cancer.
Yeah, it just feels great that the department is investing in our safety.
They're doing a lot more to save us and save the future firefighters.
Health and safety of our members is of utmost importance, if not the most important thing we do on a day-to-day basis.
We want to make sure that there is life after the fire department.
We have to do more to make sure we protect our firefighters. Really looking at how do we make sure that this job is as safe as it can be, both while they're doing their job and then when they're not doing their job back at the firehouses. We need to make sure we have the best technology. We can't have a ladder truck pulling to a scene and breaking down.
We've been able to go out and buy 23 new engine companies for the city of Boston. Each one of them is coming with a 30-gallon foam bladder, which will give us significant capability on the fire ground, so firefighters aren't up close and personal being exposed needlessly. Car fires and dumpster fires use that foam and stay away from the smoke. Reduce that chronic exposure time and protect yourselves.
The new equipment we have seems to be doing that a lot better than what we used to have. Certainly, when I first got on the job, the equipment we had then was a jacket and a pair of pants. Now we have the jumper gear, we have the boots, we have everything.
The goal of having better bunker gear and having better SCBAs is to reduce the amount of time that we're being exposed. We have 45-minute bottles now, which help a great deal when we're doing overhaul. It gives us a little bit of extra time to be on air. We want to be able to protect the membership as much as we possibly can from the dangers that they're facing.
If it's going to keep those chemicals away from your body, that's great.
Our fire department's not changing. Our identity is not changing. But our approach to health and safety is changing.
We're really starting to see the cultural change. Firefighters are going to fires now. They're more cognizant of their environments. They're keeping their masks on. They clean themselves when they come back. They're washing their bunker gear. And they're following all the different tactical changes we've made.
I did go for a physical every year, and that's how it was originally spotted. That was a come to God moment.
We really need firefighters to get comprehensive physical exams on an annual basis. The checklist that we use is a form that they bring to their primary care physician to get these aggressive screening tests at an early stage. The prognosis of catching cancers early in firefighters is excellent. There are many firefighters in Boston working today who feel blessed because they took part in our physical exams.
I think every time I go back to the doctors and they tell me I'm cancer-free, it's like a new day.
Compared to what I felt like back then, this feels great.
This could happen to any of us, and just try and be safe.
Wash your hoods, wash your bunker gear, wash your personal gear. If you notice anything abnormal that wasn't there before, regardless of whether you're feeling symptoms or not, go get it checked out.
Early detection is best. There's so many cures out there for so many cancers that were a death sentence before, now they're not.
You can beat cancer. I did it, living proof of it. You gotta have a little levity with it too. You can't let it sink you down and make you depressed. There's a lot of nicknames for me in the firehouse having one testicle. OB, one ball, and I roll with it.
What I've learned in 33 years as a firefighter is that you tend to develop a sense of invincibility. I'm here to caution you on that. The toxins and carcinogens that are produced by fire don't care about your sense of invincibility. They will attack, you will not see them, and eventually you will be diagnosed and you'll end up spending 30 years in a firehouse and yet only get 2 years in your beach house. Think about your wife, your children, your significant other, because that's the one that matters the most. It's about reaching retirement and enjoying your family, because you've truly earned it.
Cancer is connected to firefighting. Cancer is connected to firefighting. We know that. This isn't something that we're saying, well, there's a possible connection. We know as firefighters, governments have studied this, they've acknowledged it, and there is a connection to firefighting. You can minimize the risk. That's what's important. And it's a double-edged sword. We not only have to ensure that we have proper compensation for firefighters when they get diagnosed with cancer, but you have to do every single thing you can to minimize your cancer risk. It's underestimated. I could go into a whole presentation on how we have what's called a healthy worker effect, where firefighters, when they start work, are anywhere from 20 to 30% healthier than the general population. But within 5 to 10 years, we see that there's 25% increase from the general population. So that's not a 20 to 25% increase to your personal risk. It might be a doubling of risk from what you were. Because firefighters, to get in the fire department, you have to be physically fit. You have to be cancer screened. So that's why our cancer risks should be less, and it isn't. This presentation is done in honor of all our firefighters who have died of cancer, especially those who were our spokespersons and succumbed to their occupational cancers. And I know that there's firefighters here who have come to this, and they put their lives out to the public and the media because they have cancer and they want to tell the story. And I applaud each and every one of you. I'm not going to ask you to put your hands up or anything because I know it's a very private thing, but I know that I was approached last night by a number of firefighters who have occupational cancer and have had to go through the court system and in many cases have been successful in Europe. And 10 years ago, that wasn't the case. So you are making inroads. I've been doing this for 20 years, and it's just amazing what we've accomplished here. And I don't say this enough publicly, but I know each and every one of you who have put your hearts and soul into it. 20 years ago, 16 years ago, Winnipeg did a partnership with Ken Block and Greg Halabowicz, and we were able to push the presumptive legislation across Canada. In Europe, like I said, the sauna, I think it was 10 or 11 years ago with Kim. I can't say enough about Kim Nikula, Michael Svedberg, and Andrew Sederberg, because they've been really some of the biggest movers and shakers that have come into Europe and pushing this. In Sweden, I believe you're on the precipice of this, and I think you're going to be attacked more than other countries. I think they're going to try and stop you from trying to advance your cancer issues. And I think you've done some tremendous things in Sweden, getting firefighters covered for occupational cancer. In Denmark, Tommy Cure, I always talk about the sacrifices and putting everything into it. There's no one here that's put more of his heart and soul into the cancer issue than Tommy Cure. And I just want to thank you for what you do in Europe. And you never take no for an answer, and that's what you have to do. I want to thank you. Other people that are here, like Norway, Tommy Christofferson. Tommy out of Norway, he put on the last conference, unbelievable show. Moving forward, he's a tremendous advocate for firefighters in Norway. Marcus Buckert out of Germany. I was in Germany a few years ago, and you have an uphill battle, but you aren't taking no for an answer, and I really appreciate what you do in Germany. Peter Marshall, one of the most amazing things I've seen politically in my career, and we're a very political entity, is what happened in Australia from 2010 to about 2012, where literally the majority of the country went and created presumptive legislation and created prevention techniques across Australia that in many cases are second to none around the world. And I just want to congratulate you, Peter, as well for what you do. And our new Icelandic friends, Chief Markinson and Bjarni Ingmarsson. Man, you couldn't have two better people working for the Icelandic firefighters. When we met with them yesterday, you could see that they're committed to push this issue forward on prevention and what's needed to protect your firefighters. You're very lucky to have leadership such as this in the Iceland firefighters. Again, this is a battle that it may take a generation to get in Europe, but it's going to happen. And it's going to happen because it's the right thing to do. And history is going to show that cancer was likely the biggest issue to hit the fire service in the last 50 years. And we were on the right side of this issue. Thank you very much.